Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video series and podcast about the ongoing task of designing better miniature games. Designing miniature games is something that I very much like to do. In fact, I can't stop doing it as much as I would like to. Glenn shares in my obsession and also designs games of other sorts involving cards and boards. But we are back here talking as ever on the minutiae and delicate intricacies of designing better miniature games. One of my favorite people in the world is David Lynch, and he makes this sort of hand movement whenever he says the word idea. And he has lots of good quotes about this, but one of them is that the idea dictates everything and you have to be true to that or you're dead. And in the last conversation, we were talking about designing thematic mechanics. And we did two things. One is we exploded the word theme into, in fact, the things that we have shorthanded into that word, meaning subject matter and conceit and genre, as well as the actual themes of the piece. But also, we sort of talked about the fact that at the heart, at least from my perspective, at the heart of every game design is an idea. And you have to be true to that idea or the game design just dies. And at somewhere, on some level, almost every component of the game, whether it's a rule or a piece of writing or the front cover or the choice of the miniatures or the size of the ruler, like all of these things that you're telling your player are all in service of this idea. And so I guess there's a couple of ways of tackling the second half of this conversation, which is how do you actually go about wiring together the crunchy game mechanics with the thing that you're trying to evoke? And quite often people will call that theme. Glenn has helpfully broken that out into those four different things. And as a shorthand, I might just refer to it as the idea, which is the thing I'm trying to beam into your brain as you play my game. And it's whatever that thing that was exciting or electrifying that I wanted to convey. So we'll probably touch a bunch of different topics on this. Glenn, have you got a place that you want to go to first on the challenge of crunchy rules, sloppy idea? How do you wire those things together to communicate them?
Okay, so yeah, it's difficult to sort of set this out as a set of sort of hard rules, but I think one of the things you can do is use your, if you sit down at the start and you come up with the idea and then you decide on, let's say, a rough background and a genre. So for example, these are all movable feasts and you can swap them in and out as you go along, but for example, I want to create a sense of people laughing as their stuff blows up, and I want to do that in a the genre of sort of post-apocalyptic car racing, and I write a background about it being a televised death race. So those are some of the things that we sort of try to do with Gaslands. And now I've given myself a set of touchstones there, a set of things that I can think of as overarching rules that I don't get a say in a way. I need to evoke some of those genre tropes. I need to match in with some of that background, and I need to create those sorts of things within the player. And so in many ways, you can think of your theme and your background and your genre not as something that you, not as a weight that you have to sort of reach for, but as a sort of roadmap for whether or not your game is failing. It's a nice way where, as you're play testing, you can go back and go, well, did this work? It didn't blue screen on the tabletop and people got through the game and said they enjoyed it, but did it work? Well, let's see. Did it do X, Y, and Z? Did a car blow up? Did the car blow up in midair and then somebody whose car it was happy about the fact it blew up and thought it was funny and enjoyed it blowing up? Did it blow up because it was ramshackle and patched together, and somebody had idiotically strapped an overly large gun on the front of it, and firing that gun shoved them backwards into a wall. Have those things occurred? Because those are our genre sort of moments. Those are our cinematic elements. Did we manage to do those things? So it can give you a checklist to make sure that the rules you've got are doing what they're doing. Now, a trial and error version of that is obviously going to take you a little while, but it is nice that they can give you those guidelines. So I think one of the things you want to do is try and figure out what you might call the story beats or the story moments of and whether you want it to be a novel or a movie or a TV show that your game is, figure out what those story beats are. What happens in every single one of the movies that you're trying to recreate, every single one of the novels or whatever happens to be. What happens in every single war movie that you love? What happens in every single post-apocalyptic movie that you enjoy? What has to occur? Those are your sort of story beats. Figure out.
You're using the word story there, but we're using you're I perceive you're using that quite loosely to mean like, moments in an action sequence, or beats in the like exciting recounting of, well, the game last night was great because X and Y happened.
Yeah. And so then you need to figure out what physical events would represent or recreate or evoke those beats. And then you need to figure out what rules would make those events possible, would cause those events to occur actually on the tabletop, and lastly, and quite importantly, would encourage players to make those events occur. Because it's all well and good having a rule set that allows the thing to happen if no player would ever go anywhere near it. And I could a few times have referred to the first edition of Carnival, which has a bunch of really lovely ideas. It has like you can be like a wall running, acrobat in that game. But you look at the rule set, and no sane person would ever use the wall running in it, because it has nothing like enough of a reward and often too much of a cost. And so they put in the things that allowed the beats they wanted to occur, because they obviously wanted some sort of Venetian parkour, thing going on, but they didn't encourage their players to actually do it. And this is one of those places where you might think that you're creating unbalanced moments in your game because you're overly rewarding players for doing something just because it's one of the beats you want to evoke. Go down that route first of all. If your first version of your game has everybody wall running constantly and springing from balcony to balcony because you just get showered with rewards every time you do it, that's a good place to start at, and then maybe crank those things back a bit, rather than building a game where everybody's glumly shuffling around on the floor, shooting each other, and nobody ever attempts to do the thing that is meant to be the cool thing in your game. So I think that's one of the places I would sort of look at as a route in on it.
Yeah, so I think that probably gives us an axis of like rewarded versus punished. So a thematic mechanic, an evocative mechanic, is definitely one which is rewarding the sort of story beats that you want from happening. And I've got a couple of other axes that have emerged as you were talking there. So I guess another one is like your game is going to have core loops, like bits of machinery that the player needs to engage with pretty constantly and think about a lot, and then some quite backgrounded mechanics, like mechanics that still have to exist in some way, but you haven't foregrounded them. And I think that from my point of view, as I'm thinking about, well, how am I going to evoke the idea in the player's mind, the thing that I want to put, right in front of their face as the sort of steering wheel is whatever the core loop is, has got to be really closely linked to the core conceit of the game. And so in Gaslands, it's the movement templates and the skid dice, because that's all to do with high octane driving and slipping and sliding and doing all kinds of action sequency stuff. And in A Billion Suns, that is the sort of jump point economy. What am I going to jump in where, because I'm trying to lift you out of any one ship and give you this sort of heads up strategic display from your interstellar war room 1600 light years away from the battle. And those are the ways that I'm trying to evoke that idea in the players' minds. And then there are other things that have to happen, like shooting or moving around in A Billion Suns, which are deliberately backgrounded in terms of their importance, their complexity, the amount of time I need to think about them and consider them and pre-consider them. So I think that's maybe that's a useful metric, is like when it's not my go, assuming that this is a game with downtime, when it's not my go, what am I thinking about as a player? What am I sort of worrying about and pre-calculating? Because that better be really, really closely linked to your conceit or your subject matter.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this obviously is about trying to access sort of the player's psychology at various points, and I think it's one of the places that some games go wrong with this is they write a set of rules that don't specifically make somebody feel a particular way, and then they dump a load of conceits essentially on top of it. And they say, okay, well, we called it that, so that means it's that, and we called this that, so that means it's that, and no one feels that way it's happening. Now, conceits are really important and very, very useful. One of the great things that you can do with conceits is help people to learn the rules of a game. You name things, certain things that happen within a story. People tell themselves that story, and that helps to lock into their mind the rules that they're using. If you call a certain rule sharpshooter, people know that they want to give sharpshooter to the thing that they want to shoot with, and they probably want to put that thing back from the front line, because sharpshooters don't tend to sprint around too much. And it's going to teach somebody the strategies of the game, the rules of the game. Conceits are super duper useful and really handy, but they never evoke feelings in people on the tabletop. Nobody triggers their sharpshooter and feels that triggering sharpshooter, making the guy run across the tabletop and hit somebody with a plank of wood, does make them feel like they just triggered a sharpshooter just because it was called that. That's not how that works. If they trigger sharpshooter and then like a model that was like 60 inches away behind a wall, hiding with a hedge, and had one ear popped up, and the sharpshooter managed to pop his head, and no other model on the table could do that. See my badass sharpshooter, you don't mess with him, he's a dead-eyed killer. That's your moment. That's something you give someone.
I think that is absolutely the third axis as well. So I think you've got reward and punishment, and you've got like foregrounded and backgrounded, and I think the other is whether or not something is sort of didactic or forced or just named something versus emergent. Because if you're trying to hit this story beat and you're rewarded for it, and it's one of the things that you were worrying about, it's focused on, and what actually happens to create that beat, it emerges from intersecting mechanics. It's not something where the rule, as you say, it's not simply called sharpshooter, you shoot better, but it's like, because you're on a high ledge, and because this person can only be seen a bit, and because you're far enough away, like the conditions have been met for a cinematic moment of sharpshooting, and therefore crack, you get +3 to your shoot. And the table can clearly, the players around the table can clearly see, wow, what a cool sharpshooting moment that was. So yeah, I think that in terms of designing thematic, it's like designing thematic rules. It's like designing thematic moments, making sure that thematic moments emerge from those.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're trying to create the moments that are going to stick in someone's mind, and they're going to stick in their mind because you've evoked the motifs and the genres that you said you were going to evoke. That the guy, I think one of the things about background. So you're going to write a background for your game, and it's going to be a story in a world in which this is set. You're going to say that that guy is the close combat powerhouse, and that guy is the long range super sniper. You need to make sure that what happens on the tabletop matches the background you just wrote for people. Because there's, there's no crueler thing you can do than say to somebody, this is how this is going to work, and then it doesn't work that way. It's like, you a lot of the time with Games Workshop games, because of they pull in a lot of younger kids. The number of times you see a sort of relatively young kid come out, and it's the first time he's got this particular unit out of the box, and it said on the box that this unit was a super killy, unstoppable monster of glory, and then it just gets its head punched in the first 5 minutes because
Glenn's making this out like it's a child. This is every time Mike buys a monster in Warhammer. Oh, look at it! It's so big and scary. Oh, it's dead.
Well, this is the thing. Sometimes hyperbole can be your enemy. Don't suggest that.
Right, but like I also think that like on this didactic versus emergent thing, like I do actually believe in naming rules in a way that's evocative, because I find like as part of building up this sort of superstructure of suspension of disbelief and investment in the core idea, like you've got to use every part of the game's surface area to try and beam your message into the opposing player. And so if the rule could be called +2 to shoot, or it could be called, gunslinger or something, like, go with the thing that like has a reference or has a little sort of beat inside it, because then at least people will be reading through your game and wiring into the sort of universe that you're trying to place them in. And so I don't think it's that, we're certainly not saying don't name your rules a certain way. It's simply that, as you're saying there, like, because somebody has been described in the fiction as being, the quickest gunslinger in the West, then they could have a quickest gunslinger in the West special rule where they always sling guns the quickest, or they could have some combination of rules where it's pretty tricky for anyone to sling guns quicker than them under the right circumstances.
Yeah, and don't call something the glory killer destroyer of worlds and then have it turn up on the tabletop and get punched to death in 2 minutes. Don't say that something is, the long
unless your game is about hyperbolous names and
pointless levels of hyperbole. If everything in the game is named to a ridiculous, over the top level,
can we think maybe I need to write a combat system where you have to use hyperbole as your randomizer.
Possibly, yeah. But if something says it's the super doom cannon, make it so that if something gets hit by the super doom cannon, the thing dies, for goodness sakes. You could call it the really unwieldy and difficult to aim doom cannon, but if it's a doom cannon, things that get hit by it get doomed. If somebody is the sword of slaughter, if someone gets stabbed by said person, that person dies. He might be slow and sluggish and not able to get around the table, and that's all fine. But by God, when he gets up there and wangs somebody in the head with his sword, don't have that person then go, I actually didn't hurt very much, so I'm okay actually now, and then just wander off. Pay out your background. And you know what? If you can't pay out your background, if you've put in things that clash with each other so that they can't both be what you said they were, rewrite the background. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not set in stone. If you write a certain background and then you make a game and the game's fun and lovely, but it turns out the unit that you thought was going to be great at like long range is actually really fantastic close up, just name the dude differently. Just say, oh, he's the close up, like he shoots you with his guns from 4 inches away because he's so fast with his ninja shooting. Don't keep insisting that he's some long range sniper master and have people going, this doesn't work anything like the way it says it does, because it just upsets and confuses people, and it's, it's unnecessary. You can, people say, oh, how do you write thematic rules? Well, sometimes you can write a rule and then write some theme that describes what the rule just did. If the rule does something cool, just write a story that describes the cool thing that happened. That's an entirely acceptable way of doing it. You know what I mean? You don't have to write the theme and then fit the rule to it. It does work in both directions. Sometimes it's a lot easier to write the story than redesign a whole chunk of game.
So one thing that I really like about Man of War is when you cast a spell. I think this is mostly true of all of Warhammer's history, actually, but Man of War, it always seems to be the place where I take the time to do this. When you cast a spell, there is a little like live action description of what actually happens. It says, the sorcerer raises his arms and the winds blow around and the flags all turn green because he's casting some jade magic. Ta-da! Roll 3 dice, and if you get any 6s, the other guy cries or whatever. And I suppose there's this like potential other way of like introducing theatre into the game by sort of saying, well, here's, whether it's literally reading something out or it's sort of the way that things are positioned or whatever, or the way that you're allowed to move miniatures on the table, or the sort of tokens that you put next to them. But I do think there's something about like when you take a specific action that's kind of important or it's rare, I think it's okay to maybe find ways to sort of allow the players to savor that moment or enjoy it or marinate in it.
Well, I think there's a useful principle there, which is about figuring out in a way where the blind spots of a game are, in a way. So you take, for example, Man of War there, and the Man of War card says that this wizard does something, and well, that's fine because a Man of War ship is that big, and so the wizard is about that big. So that wizard could be dancing around and running up and down the sails and hanging off the rigging. You could say that a wizard's doing anything you like. If you'd had like a Warhammer army where the wizard is yay big, you can't say, well, what the wizard does is he runs up and down the entire length of the battlefield, high-fiving all of the guys as he goes. No, he doesn't. He moves about 4 inches a turn. That's not going to happen. If he could run that fast, I'm going to have him ninja over to the other side of the, So you can't say that he does this thing, that the things in, say, Warhammer that you can say he does in Man of War. But in Warhammer, for example, you've got all these magical items described in a certain way, which is fine because you don't need to like see the magical item. And then it says, oh, when the wizard activates this magical item, he pulls it out of his pocket and he goes, and then the thing happens. And so be aware, like I say, of what the blind spots are of your game, what things are expected to be represented physically and what things nobody expects you to represent physically.
Yeah, I really like that.
And then you can go, okay, nobody's expecting this thing to be visible on the tabletop. Everyone understands that it's going to be a story beat moment. I can have some fun with that, Yeah,
I mean, like in Hobgoblin, much like in Warhammer, like a place that happens is in spell casting, where you cast some spells. Until Games Workshop released plastic miniatures for spells, no one ever expected you to represent spells on the tabletop. They were just in your mind, and so you could describe the spell as anything you wanted: rats pouring out of the ground, colossal feet coming down from the ground, from the sky, Monty Python style. Like they could be anything. And I do really like that idea that you've caught on there. I'm going to give that some more thought, because I think like the equivalent in Gaslands is the drivers have perks, and you never really see the drivers because we're in a game of toy cars. So a lot of stuff can go on inside the car. People can be throwing Molotovs, and drivers can be cool or have one eye or whatever. Like, and it doesn't. That's all white space for the game design, because it doesn't have to conform to the outside silhouette of the vehicle. And yeah, I guess in A Billion Suns, it's maybe like there's an amount of off-screen activity in the sort of commander of the fleet. There's also a potential, but I don't think it's really been realized, of like what's going on inside the ships. I suppose one place that it does really come through is that the game tells a lot of like sci-fi stories, by just saying like, this is a mining ship and this is an asteroid and this is a, like, I don't have to show what is on that facility to say it's a diseased facility that needs medical assistance, or it's got spies on and they're escaping.
Yeah, exactly. In A Billion Suns, as of a lot of these things in A Billion Suns, it's about the contract system, and it's where you say, okay, that facility is ravished with plague, and everybody in it is dying horribly, and it's like, well, it's a space station. Anything could be happening in there, and then you go over and your ship tries to cure them, and you get hits because you've been partly infected by the plague, and then you siphon off the crew with a little marker and you run it over to the jump point, and then you fire them off in their escape pod into the jump point, and then you get your reward. And that's a series of story beats. I think A Billion Suns is a good example of a game that's built out of story beats. You go, okay, there's a facility that has the genius scientist on that's riddled with disease. You don't need to see the genius scientist. You don't need to see the disease. There's a facility. And our story beat 1 is we have to get in there and get him out while he's on the ship. And story beat 2 is we need to make his desperate escape to the jump point and then fire him off to the home base through an escape pod. And we've all seen that happen in various sci-fi films, the person being saved and then trying to escape in the little ship as it's being chased by the bigger ship. Those are the moments that game is about, and you give people the opportunity to create those moments, and then you reward them for creating them. And so you create a story, a game that tells a story on the tabletop. Those are the moments you go through to create these things, and you don't just dump a bunch of names onto stuff. You don't tell people what story they're experiencing. I'm not a novelist. I don't just write a story and then hit somebody with it and go, there you go, that's what you experienced. I say, okay, here's a thing and there's a thing and there's a thing, and you're going to do them in that sequence, and they're going to look like this, and they're going to recreate that moment. Tell yourself a story about that, and hopefully that story is going to be a story similar to Star Wars or Mad Max or whatever else it happens to be that I'm trying to cause people to experience. That's the idea. And hopefully, and I think it's the bigger hopefully they feel a certain way about that story. And a lot of the time we cause people to feel things like frustration or excitement or anger. Excitement for killing usually, but excitement and tension and a tiny bit of fear that they're facing.
Excitement for frustrating their opponents.
And those are as emotional as we usually get, which I think sometimes is a pity. And I hope that we're going to get more and more into sort of deeper sort of feelings and reactions, but we'll have to see how far we can extend the form with that sort of thing. So I think hopefully that's a few guidelines for some rules or some guide points as to how to go about creating some of these rules. I don't know if there's anything particularly, any other sort of touchstones or moments you want to mention. So yeah, like I said, I think try and again, as we say quite a few times, this is one of the places where a good, strong, set of design principles and design documents can really help you out. At some point, sit down, lay out for yourself what it is you're trying to achieve with the game and some moments. And within that design document, some story beats. Something at some point in the game has got to do X, it's got to do Y, it's got to make people say, oh, that was just like movie X. Hopefully
one of the things actually that I have done in the past, and because as you're talking about design principles, like certainly trying to capture what the idea is or what's important about it as one of your design principles, I think is really good. Another thing that you can do is when you're trying to capture this idea and bottle it, you can get a bunch of things from your house or from the internet and you can lay them out in a mood board. And I know it sounds kind of goofy, but like I've literally got a photograph from when I gathered together my toy cars and my copy of Mad Max on DVD and Death Race and some 2000 AD comics, and I just made a big pile of them on my dining room table, and I just sort of looked at them and poked them and then took a photo of them. It was like, this is the flavor this is what I like. There needs to be little moments of evocation from all of these different things. And so as well as in your design principles, I think like in order to know what the idea is that you're trying to communicate, I think that can be another, like mood boarding can be another useful way, being okay to sort of, and those references don't have to all be like literal genre references to the things you're trying to evoke. Like one of those things was, like Micro Machines, like that was, anyway, but like, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. If usually there's a moment that triggered a design in your head, don't let that moment go necessarily. And if you can, go back to it. If it was a movie, or something like that, rewatch it. Remember which moment it is that fired you off, and go, okay, I don't need to literally beat by beat, word for word recreate that moment, but I want something that gets people to feel the way that I felt just then playing the game. And if you can do that just once or twice, then I think you've won fairly big. Okay, I think with that we will sign off in this episode of Rule of Carnage. I hope that some parts of those bits of guidance are going to help people to figure out, if not design more thematic rules, at least figure out which rules are thematic, and figure out when they're going a little bit off the path, and understand which things are actually going to help build your genre beats and your thematic moments, and which things are conceits which have their own uses and their own purposes but are not themselves genre moments, and they will never make you a genre moment just by the names themselves. They have different purposes that are useful and worthwhile, but don't actually mesh in inherently and in and of themselves just because you call them those things. But for now, thank you for watching, if indeed you still are. If you are watching, I assume you like some part of what we're doing. Please do like and subscribe. Look us up on social media. But I think for this episode of Royal Carnage, we're going to say thank you and goodbye. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.